April 1775, Reims, France. A crowd of 200 hungry people surrounds a monastery. They're not asking for prayers, they're demanding bread. At a fair price. The monks panic. They hand out loaves. The crowd disperses. No violence, not yet. 1 month later, May 1775. Over 300 riots explode across northern France. Grain warehouses looted, merchants beaten, bakers' shops ransacked, an entire country on fire over bread. The government calls it the Flour War. But this wasn't a war, it was a warning nobody listened to. Because 14 years later, in July 1789, the same anger would return. But this time, instead of looting bakeries, the people would storm the Bastille. Instead of demanding fair prices, they would demand heads, literally. By October, the king and queen would be prisoners. By 1793, they'd be dead, guillotined in front of cheering crowds. And it all started with something so stupid, so obvious, so preventable: the price of bread. But here's what nobody tells you about the French Revolution. It wasn't just about expensive bread. It was about a tax, a salt tax, the gabelle, the most hated, most unfair, most ridiculous tax in French history. Bread accounted for 60 to 80% of the budget of a wage earner's family in the Ancien Regime. And you need salt to make bread. You need salt to preserve food. You need salt to survive. But in 18th century France, salt could cost 10 sous per pound in Paris, while southern provinces paid almost nothing. The same essential commodity. 10 times the price, depending on which side of an imaginary line you were born. And if you couldn't afford the salt, if you tried to smuggle cheaper salt from another province, you could be sentenced to 10 years as a galley slave, or death if caught with weapons. Death for salt, for trying to feed your family. Today you're going to see how a medieval salt monopoly and an idiotic experiment in free market grain prices destroyed the most powerful monarchy in Europe. How one controller general's refusal to control bread costs lit a fuse that burned for 14 years, and how the guillotine that killed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was built from hunger, salt, and really bad economic policy. Let me show you what life was like. It's spring 1775. You're 34 years old. You're a carpenter in Paris, skilled tradesman, good hands. You can build anything. You spend half your daily wage on bread, every day half. The other half goes to rent, clothes, firewood, and salt. You need salt to preserve the bit of meat you can afford once a week. You need salt to make the bread you can't quite afford. You need salt to live. But salt isn't a market commodity in France. It's a government monopoly. The gabelle. By the 1780s, it raises more than 55 million livres per year, over 10% of royal tax revenue. Here's how it works, or doesn't work. France is divided into regions. In Paris, you pay 10 sous per pound for salt. In Brittany, you pay almost nothing. In Anjou, you pay 591 sous. In the neighboring province across the Loire River, 31 sous. Same salt. 20 times the price difference, based on nothing. No logic, no reason. Just centuries of accumulated royal decrees, exemptions, and monopoly agreements that nobody bothered to fix. And it's not optional. Peasants are required by law to buy a certain quantity called the salt of duty, even if they don't need it. 7 kilograms per person per year, whether you use it or not, whether you can afford it or not. The nobility and clergy are exempt. They don't pay. You do, the third estate. The 98% who aren't nobles or priests. Your neighbor Jean is a salt smuggler, a faux saunier they call it. He crosses into Brittany once a month, buys salt for 31 sous, brings it back to Paris, sells it for 8 sous. Still profit for him, massive savings for buyers. He's been doing it for 2 years. Last month, soldiers caught him at a checkpoint. He had a knife in his belt for cutting rope, he says. The soldiers don't care. Armed smuggling means death. They hanged him last week. His wife and 3 children are begging on the streets now. No husband, no income, no mercy. All because of salt. Salt that costs 20 times more on one side of a river than the other. Salt that the rich don't even pay for. But salt is just the foundation of the anger. The real explosion comes from grain, because in 1774, a new controller general takes office. His name is Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot. He's a brilliant economist, an enlightened thinker, a believer in free markets. He looks at France's grain system and sees government control, price controls, regional regulations, police oversight. And he thinks this is inefficient. This stifles competition. This prevents the market from working its magic. So in September 1774, Turgot abolishes grain price controls. Let the market decide, he says. Free trade will balance supply and demand. Prices will stabilize naturally. Everyone will benefit, except they don't. Because Turgot made one catastrophically stupid assumption, that grain was like any other commodity, that you could apply free market principles to the thing people need to literally not die. Before Turgot's edict, every region faced its own shortages, so some would suffer famine while others would be spared. With liberalization, grain could leave spared regions to go to the worst affected areas, causing significant price increases and shortages everywhere, affecting more people more quickly. Speculators buy up grain in cheap areas, ship it to expensive areas, hoard it, wait for prices to spike, sell at massive profit. It's Economics 101, arbitrage, perfectly rational behavior. Except when the commodity is food and the result is starvation. By spring 1775, bread prices have skyrocketed. The price of grain and bread rose suddenly and became a desperate burden on the poorest populations. You're spending not half but 3/4 of your wage on bread. Your wife is watering down the soup. Your kids are hungry, always hungry. And here's what makes you furious. You know the grain is there. You saw the barges on the Seine. You saw the warehouses full of sacks. But the merchants won't sell. They're waiting for prices to go higher. Your neighbor Marie, Jean's widow, hasn't eaten in 3 days. She spent her last coins on bread for her children. She's skeletal, hollow-eyed, dying in front of you. On May 3rd, 1775, you and 200 others marched to the grain market. You don't have weapons, you're not violent, you just want bread, at a fair price. The merchant laughs at you. Market price, he says. Take it or leave it. So you take it. You seize the grain. You hand the merchant what you think is fair. This practice is known as popular taxation, taxation populaire. You're not stealing. You're correcting an injustice. Within days, 300 riots explode across France. The Flower War has begun. The government sends troops. They arrest hundreds. They execute ringleaders. Turgot is forced to restore price controls, but the damage is done. The people have learned something. The government will let you starve to protect economic theory. The rich will hoard food while children die. The system is rigged, and that lesson will simmer. For 14 years, here's where it gets really stupid. The Flower War should have been a wake-up call, a flashing red light screaming, "Fix the system." But the French government learned exactly the wrong lesson. Turgot gets blamed. Free markets get blamed. Enlightenment economics gets blamed. So they go back to the old system. Price controls, regional regulations, government oversight. Except they don't fix the underlying problems. The gabelle is still there, still unfair, still enraging millions. The tax system is still broken. The nobility and clergy are still exempt from most taxes. The burden still falls entirely on the third estate. And worse, the weather turns against them. The problems became acute in the 1780s because of a range of factors, including a huge rise in population without a corresponding increase in native grain production. Bad harvest in 1788. Brutal winter. Crop failures. By spring 1789, bread prices are astronomical. When grain crops failed 2 years in a row, in 1788 and 1789, the price of bread shot up to 88% of wages. 88% of your entire wage. For bread, just bread. You're not eating meat anymore, you're not buying clothes, you're barely surviving. And you're paying the gabelle on top of it. Salt you can't afford. For bread, you can barely buy. On the morning of October 5th, 1789, women in the marketplaces of Paris were near rioting over the high price and scarcity of bread. Their demonstrations turned into a march. 7,000 women, armed with pikes, knives, and fury. They march to Versailles, 12 miles, in the rain. They surround the palace. They demand bread. They demand the king return to Paris. They demand accountability. The king has no choice. He agrees. The royal family is escorted back to Paris, prisoners in all but name. But here's the truly insane part. Even after the revolution starts, even after the Bastille falls, Even after the king becomes a prisoner, the bread crisis continues. On August 29, 1789, only 2 days after completing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, the Constituent Assembly completely deregulated domestic grain markets. 2 days! They just finished declaring that all men have equal rights, and immediately they deregulate grain, again. Because some economists in the Assembly still believe free markets will solve everything. It doesn't work. Again. Shortages worsen, prices spike, people starve. On October 21, 1789, a baker, Denis Francois, was accused of hiding loaves from sale. Despite a hearing which proved him innocent, the crowd dragged Francois to the Place de Grève, hanged and decapitated him, and made his pregnant wife kiss his bloodied lips. Read that again. A baker, proven innocent, hanged and decapitated, his pregnant wife forced to kiss his severed head. That's what hunger does. That's what happens when you ignore bread prices for decades while telling people the market will sort it out. By 1793, the convention is forced to implement the law of the maximum. Price controls on everything. Bread, meat, salt, wine, everything. The limitations imposed by the maximum discouraged farmers and producers who began producing less or hoarding what they did produce. Classic economics. When you cap prices below market rate, supply disappears. So the government sends armed raiders into the countryside to seize grain by force. They requisition, they confiscate, they threaten. France, the richest country in Europe, is now looting its own farmers to feed its cities. And through all of this, the guillotine works overtime. Nobles, priests, merchants, bakers, hoarders, speculators, anyone accused of making the bread crisis worse. The Reign of Terror isn't just about ideology, it's about hunger. Hunger that started with the gabelle, hunger that exploded with Turgot's free market experiment, hunger that nobody in power took seriously until it was too late. So what's the lesson from this catastrophe? First, understand this. Food is not a commodity, it's a necessity. You can apply free market principles to luxury goods, to services, to entertainment. But when you apply them to food without safeguards, people starve. And when people starve, they revolt. Turgot wasn't evil. He was brilliant. He believed in liberty, efficiency, and rational markets. He thought freeing grain prices would benefit everyone. He was catastrophically wrong. Because markets assume rational actors with choices. But a starving person has no choice. They'll pay anything for bread, or they'll take it by force. Second lesson, taxes matter, not just the amount, the fairness. The gabelle wasn't the highest tax in France, but it was the most hated. Why? Because it was arbitrary, because it was unequal, because nobles didn't pay it, but peasants did. Researchers estimate that an average French household in the low-tax region paid approximately 805 euros, compared to 4,189 euros in the high-tax zone. 5 times more. For the same salt. For no reason. When people see that kind of injustice, when they watch the rich exempt themselves while the poor suffer, they don't just resent the tax, they resent the entire system. Third lesson, crises accumulate. They compound. The Flower War of 1775 didn't cause the Revolution of 1789, but it set the stage. It taught people that riots work, that the government will back down under pressure, that violence gets results. 14 years later, when the next bread crisis hit, the people didn't petition. They didn't wait for the government to fix things. They went straight to violence, because they'd learned that's what works. Fourth lesson, and this one should terrify you. Solving economic problems requires political courage that politicians rarely have. Everyone knew the gabelle was broken. Everyone knew the tax system was unjust. Everyone knew bread prices were a powder keg. But fixing it meant taking on the nobility, taking on the clergy, taking on centuries of entrenched privilege. So they didn't. They kicked the can down the road. They made minor tweaks. They hoped things would get better on their own. Until the day 7,000 women marched to Versailles with pikes. Until the day the king's head fell into a basket. Until the day the most powerful monarchy in Europe collapsed into blood and chaos. All because nobody wanted to fix a stupid salt tax and implement real price protections for bread. The tragedy of the French Revolution isn't that it happened. It's that it was preventable. Completely, obviously preventable. If they'd abolished the gabelle in 1750, if they'd maintained reasonable price controls on grain, if they'd taxed the nobility and clergy fairly, there would have been no flour war, no storming of the Bastille, no reign of terror. But they didn't, because short-term politics always wins over long-term survival. Fifth lesson: when you ignore the warnings, the explosion is always worse than you imagine. The flour war was a warning. 300 riots, hundreds arrested. Clear message: fix this or else. They didn't fix it. So 14 years later, they got the guillotine. How many warnings are we ignoring right now? How many bread prices are we letting spiral? How many unjust taxes are we maintaining because fixing them requires courage? Food riots happened in France in 1709, 1725, 1749, 1775, and 1789. Each one a warning, each one ignored, until the final one that destroyed everything. The final truth: revolutions don't start with manifestos. They start with hunger, with mothers who can't feed their children, with workers who spend everything they earn on bread and still go to bed hungry. The philosophers and politicians come later. They write the slogans, they build the ideology. But the fuel, the raw explosive anger that powers revolutions, that comes from empty stomachs. France ignored bread prices for generations. They let the gabelle poison the relationship between government and people. They chose economic theory over human survival. And they paid for it with an empire, with a monarchy, with tens of thousands of lives. The guillotine didn't fall because people read too much Rousseau. It fell because bread was too expensive and salt was too unfair and nobody in power cared until it was too late. That's the real lesson of the French Revolution. Not liberty, equality, fraternity. But this: ignore hunger at your peril. Make taxes unfair at your peril. Treat food as a commodity at your peril. Because hungry people don't write petitions, they storm palaces, and they bring guillotines. So now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching this from, your city, your country. Because this story isn't about 1789. It's about what happens when governments ignore food prices and maintain unfair taxes. Are you seeing it where you live? Food inflation that doesn't match the official numbers? Taxes that fall harder on the poor than the rich? Political leaders who prioritize economic theory over people's ability to eat? Tell me what you're seeing on the ground. Let's map the warnings before they become revolutions. And if this video showed you how something as simple as bread and salt can destroy an empire, hit that subscribe button. This is Collapso, where we prove that the biggest collapses start with the smallest stupidities. See you in the next collapse.